The world is on a knife edge. There's over 100 armed conflicts currently taking place right across the globe. Some of these are new, others have been going on for decades. But each episode will break down everything you need to know to understand the battles shaping the world today. Welcome to the War Zone. I'm Maddie Hale. This week, we're looking at the China-Taiwan conflict. While this fight is not exactly a war, it could be soon. The simple explanation is that China believes Taiwan should be a part of its territory, while Taiwan has governed independently since 1949 and would like to stay that way. While Taiwan continues to push back against China's unifying efforts, China has threatened to use military force if need be. US intelligence believes that China has a strategic goal to invade Taiwan by 2027. That's only 2.5 years from now. So is a war brewing, and how ready is the United States to lend a hand? Joining me now to break this all down for us is Mark Cancian, former US Marine Corps and now Senior Advisor at the International Security Program. Mark, thanks so much for joining me today. To simplify the situation to the average viewer, in your words and understanding, how do you describe the China-Taiwan conflict?
So today you have Taiwan as an autonomous entity, China claiming it as part of its territory, and the United States providing weapons and political backing to the Taiwanese. In theory, the United States is following a course of what's called strategic ambiguity. We're not saying whether we would fight to defend Taiwan or not, but President Biden has made several statements indicating that the United States would fight to preserve Taiwanese autonomy, not independence.
Mark, if we go through the comparison of what military capabilities both countries have, Taiwan has a significantly less military personnel. They have a lot less equipment, whether that be missiles or drones or submarines or anything like that. And China has a lot more. I mean, China has the second most impressive military portfolio after the United States, so to speak. But how would Taiwan shape up if China were to strike first?
Taiwan would be in a very difficult position. And the situation today is very different from where it was, say, 30 years ago. And that follows from the fact that Taiwan has maybe 25 million people, citizens. The Chinese have 1 billion. And the Chinese have an economy, of course, it's now much expanded. So the Taiwanese are always going to be at a disadvantage. 30 years ago, that wasn't an issue because the Chinese military was not focused on expanding across the seas. It was very ground focused. Now they built that capability. So the Taiwanese military, many people argue, is now misaligned with its strategic situation. It has a military that's very well balanced, that was suitable for the first 50 years of this separation, but now is quite overshadowed by the Chinese military. They could hold on, for a short period of time, but really they need U.S. help to stand up to the Chinese.
The International Security Program, where you're a senior advisor, you guys created a board game to show a hypothetical war and how it would take place if a physical contact did arise between China and Taiwan. Can you walk me through what would happen there was 24 scenarios that the board game showed, but then there's one main scenario of the way you guys think this escalation would occur. Can you walk me through what you think would happen?
Sure. What we did is we built a war game on the basis of a lot of research, operations research, historical analyses, and we ran it really 25 times in order to get a strong analytic foundation. But the bottom line was that for most of the scenarios, the United States can maintain an autonomous and democratic Taiwan, but it comes at very high cost. The Taiwanese economy is devastated. The United States loses 2 carriers and about 15 ships, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of personnel. And it's also very damaging to the Chinese. They, in many scenarios, have a invasion that collapses, and that produces 20, 30,000 POWs. Not clear the Chinese Communist Party could survive that kind of a very public defeat.
Mark, for someone with your expertise, how do you think China would actually invade? What would the day look like when they decide in 2027, if that is the year that they do decide to invade, what that moment would look like? Would it be Chinese ships and submarines circling the island of Taiwan? It's obviously not a large area compared to China. Would it be aeroplanes? Would it be the use of having troops quite literally dropped onto the coastline of the beaches?
If the Chinese decided on an invasion, which we don't say is likely, but we do say is plausible given Chinese rhetoric and its military buildup, it would begin with what the Chinese call a fire strike, and that is an attack by missiles and aircraft against the Taiwanese forces and its government in order to strike early and damage many of those capabilities that would take out most of the Taiwanese Air Force, for example, in its surface ships. And then you would see a combined operation. That is, you would have amphibious ships leaving from the Chinese mainland, landing troops on Taiwan. They would be supported by paratroopers and air mobile troops in helicopters. In our war game, we assumed that the Chinese would attack the U.S., figuring that the United States would intervene and it would be better to get the first blow in. So there are strikes against U.S. naval forces, particularly against the two carriers, which are quite exposed early on in the conflict.
Are the Taiwanese military training for this scenario?
Well, the Chinese have been thinking about this for 30 years. This is one of their major military operation. I mean, they've looked at other smaller ones against Vietnam, for example. But this is the one that they are focused on. And the United States now has been focusing on this for 5 or 10 years. So both sides are thinking hard about what this kind of conflict would look like.
Mark, if this situation did occur, obviously the distance between China and Taiwan it's a very small difference. It's about 100 miles, 160 kilometres. How quickly could Taiwan rely on help from the United States if a strike did occur in that quick moment from China? I don't know how quickly, for the average person who didn't understand how this would work, how quickly could the United States basically appear and help out?
Well, the U.S. would help out not by getting troops onto Taiwan. That would be very difficult once the shooting starts, but by using its air forces. We assumed in our war game that the Chinese began mobilizing 30 days ahead of the invasion. The United States saw this about 15 days out and started to make some preparations, moving some forces forward, so that we'd be using our aircraft based in Japan, particularly in places like Okinawa, which is not very far from Taiwan, and then long-range bombers with long-range missiles flying out of Australia or Guam. And these could be brought to bear quite quickly. The U.S. fleet, of course, is deployed in the Western Pacific. Its problem is it's very exposed to Chinese missiles early on, and most of those ships would move east of Guam until the Chinese missile inventory declined and they could move into the Western Pacific again.
So there would be that reliance on the US bases based in Japan. Do you think that in that moment China would retaliate and start firing missiles and dropping bombs in these bases in Japan, in turn obviously causing damage and destruction in Japan?
The answer in our war games was yes, and that was quite a shock to the Japanese. Our base assumption was that the Japanese would allow the United States to use its bases in Japan, and the United States has many bases that are quite important, but would not participate itself unless the Japanese homeland were attacked. And we tested this with many senior Japanese officials, and they were all quite adamant that this is where they would end up. They pointed out that the Japanese and the United States have a close security relationship. The Japanese wouldn't want to walk away from that. But what happens is the United States then moves its aircraft into these bases and launches strikes against Chinese forces on or around Taiwan. And the Chinese figure that this is unacceptable. These aircraft are operating in sanctuary, so they attack these bases, and then very often they'll attack all of the Japanese military, figuring that if they're going to bring the Japanese in, they're going to get the first strike in. And this is what caused so much attention in Tokyo.
Well, if that did happen, Mark, they're obviously involving a lot more countries than just China and Taiwan. Do you think that this would end up where there's this, big fight, big war going on in the South China Sea involving various countries? Could it lead to an escalating wider war?
Well, it's certainly possible. We looked at potential allies for both the United States and China. China doesn't have very many allies who would be willing to come to its aid in a military sense. Of course, they're very close to the North Koreans, but the North Koreans are hunkered down facing the South Koreans. The Russians and the Chinese, of course, have been very close in recent years as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the Russian forces in the Pacific are very weak and its territory very exposed. Be very unlikely that they would jump in. Similarly, there are U.S. Allies, partners in the area, Vietnam, Singapore, for example, Philippines. Our guess is that assumption was that they would not jump in unless they were attacked or unless there were some Chinese actions in the South China Sea. We assume that the U.S. forces that are coming from the Atlantic would be coming up through the South China Sea and the Chinese would be intercepting them there. But we did not envision a wider war because most countries just would not want to get involved.
Mark, how do you think the United States' involvement in this potential war and this potential fight would be different, say, from the Cold War?
Well, since the end of the Cold War, the United States has fought regional conflicts against opponents like Iraq or Afghanistan. It's done counterinsurgency, but has not faced a peer competitor. That is a power that has capabilities similar to its own. This would be an entirely different experience for the U.S. military. To give you a sense, the United States, in most of our scenarios, loses 2 aircraft carriers right off the bat. The United States hasn't lost an aircraft carrier since 1945. We lose hundreds of aircraft, 90% on the ground. Very different experience from the sanctuary that the Air Force is accustomed to operating in. They'll land on a runway that's very bumpy because it's been hit by Chinese missiles several times. They'll taxi past literally hundreds of wrecked aircraft that were destroyed on the ground. They would move into a barracks that was vacated by the previous squadron because they were all killed in the previous missile attacks. The hospital would be full of wounded. The golf course would be turned into a cemetery, and they would be told, "Welcome to Okinawa. Tomorrow you fly over Taiwan." And that's an experience that the U.S. Air Force hasn't had since 1944, 1945.
Mark, it will obviously be a tough battle in this hypothetical situation that's obviously in your war games, but if it happened in real life in 2 years' time, as China is aiming to do, but who do you think would come out on top of a 2-day or 1-week battle?
Well, we looked at what the conflict would look like over 3 or 4 weeks. And it's very bad for both. This is a conflict that both sides should avoid. The United States loses a substantial amount of military force. It would take many years to rebuild that. And of course, the Chinese lose a major part of their fleet and have the risk of the Chinese Communist Party being ousted from power. It's something both countries should avoid.
With China having nuclear weapons, one of the more experienced nuclear programs they have there, and Taiwan not having any at all, how do you think the island has overcompensated in their military training or, I guess, plotting if they were to also strike China?
Well, we have a follow-on project that's looking at exactly this question. What would be the effect of nuclear weapons in this kind of conflict? And of course, both sides want to avoid this if possible. The situation where the Chinese might well use nuclear weapons is if their beachhead on Taiwan were collapsing. And in many of our scenarios, it does. That is, the Chinese can get ashore and can expand their beachhead, but the US and often Japan are attacking their logistics, their amphibious fleet, and the ability of the Chinese to sustain themselves on Taiwan declines. So at some point, the beachhead starts to withdraw. And the Chinese are facing this very difficult question. Do they accept defeat on Taiwan, or do they use nuclear weapons? And we have a variety of scenarios where they do use nuclear weapons.
Mark, one of the biggest theories about how Taiwan would overcompensate, as I just asked you before, is plotting to bomb or send missiles to the Three Gorges Dam, which, as you know, is a 600-kilometre big dam in China. It's a huge project. It took decades to get off the ground. It brings in billions of dollars. It would, if Taiwan would to destroy it, how catastrophic would that be for China?
Well, of course, it would be catastrophic, because if the Taiwanese could destroy it, then you would get this wall of water flowing down the gorges. But it's very hard to destroy dams long range, even with large missiles. Dams are very strong, and missiles, although they can do considerable damage, against large concrete structures, it's much harder.
Do you think that if they did pull it off, that China would retaliate with nuclear weapons enough to quite literally sink Taiwan?
Well, I think that if the Taiwanese did that, were able to destroy the dam, cause this rush of water, I mean, it would kill hundreds of thousands of people. That might well push the Chinese over the edge. Now, the Taiwanese also might do this in retaliation for Chinese nuclear attacks, or as a way to deter those attacks. In other words, you attack us with nuclear weapons, we don't have nuclear weapons, but we will use the equivalent, our conventional weapons that can cause catastrophic damage.
Mark, getting more into the political nitty-gritty, why do you think the United States and Australia and a lot of other Western allies won't recognise Taiwan as its own country just yet? As we've spoken about, that the US has vowed they've got their own big, alliance with Taiwan, but they still won't recognise it as its own country because of the one China policy. But is there a world in which that they could do both things?
Well, the Chinese are absolutely adamant that if you want to do business in China, if you want to have diplomatic relations with China, you have to accept the one China policy. And the United States and other countries have done that. Now, at some point in the future, could you imagine an independent Taiwan? Well, the word independence is literally fighting word, a fighting phrase for the Chinese, because they are adamant that Taiwan is part of China. So you might see an autonomous Taiwan continuing for many years in the future. I think that that's what the United States would like to see. If the president were ever to, the president of Taiwan were ever to meet with the president of the United States, this would be, again, a huge issue for the Chinese. So all of those visits get very sensitive. We saw that, for example, when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan. China launched all these missiles, made its criticism felt.
It did feel like in that moment, as you said, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in 2022 visited Taiwan, and it really did feel like her presence on the island made China basically stamp their feet like little kids and perform military exercises around the country to make the United States that they were there, make them know that they were there, that they were watching. What do you think that says about the way China feels about the US protecting Taiwan to some degree?
China is adamant that Taiwan is a province of China and that they expect that others will treat it that way, and they want to treat it that way themselves. So from their perspective, Speaker Pelosi was going to one of their provinces without their permission, encouraging a renegade regime in their view. So yes, these kinds of visits, hugely controversial, and the Chinese have conducted these exercises to show their displeasure.
Mark, just finally, what do you think it will take for China to leave Taiwan alone and let them govern independently?
It's going to take a long time for the Chinese will leave the Taiwanese alone. You know, this notion that it's part of China is deeply ingrained in Chinese politics, and it's not just the Chinese Communist Party either. I think the best approach for Taiwan and the United States is to enhance deterrence and strengthen warfighting if it should come to that. And in our paper, after running all these war games, we had a series of recommendations about what the United States and the Taiwanese could do to strengthen deterrence so that a war doesn't happen, so we can continue the status quo, which has been quite good for Taiwan. Taiwan has become rich and democratic, and it could go on like that indefinitely.
Mark Cancian, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me on the program.